Is the U.S. preparing for nuclear war with China, Russia, and North Korea? That's what a new leaked nuclear strategy seems to suggest. We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, a new show produced in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee, and this is my co-host, KJ Noh. KJ, why don't you start off with this week's headlines?
Massive terror attacks in Balochistan. Separatist militants attacked civilian laborers working on infrastructure and executed 23 of them in Pakistan's Balochistan region on August 26, according to Pakistani government officials. Militants also attacked a railway bridge and hotel, bringing the total deaths to nearly 40. The Baloch Liberation Army, BLA, claimed responsibilities for the killing. Members of the U.S. legislature have been overtly supporting Baloch independence since at least 2012 in order to weaken Iran and the Taliban, to facilitate U.S. corporate access to resources, and most importantly, to prevent the development of the China-Pakistan leg of the Belt and Road, in particular, the construction of a deep water port at Guadua. This port would bypass the Malacca Straits, where the U.S. intends to choke off Chinese trade during war. Earlier in 2022, 3 Chinese school teachers were killed in April, and 9 Chinese engineers were killed in a bomb attack on a bus in July.
An 18-year-old Olympic silver medalist has become a Chinese viral sensation after videos of her surfaced helping out at her family's restaurant upon returning from Paris. After coming back to her hometown in Hunan province, Zhou Yaqin, who took second place in women's balance beam, has been helping out around her father's business, waiting on tables and cleaning. The restaurant has been fully booked since Zhou's debut at the Olympics. Her father was so proud of his Olympian gymnast daughter that he had hung photos of her and her medals in every room of the restaurant.
U.S. national security elites suggest bombing Chinese dams to kill millions. Michael Rubin, a top national security strategist at the American Enterprise Institute, writing for the National Security Journal, argued recently that the Taiwan authorities should retaliate against a possible Chinese intervention against secession by attacking Chinese dams to kill tens of millions of people on the mainland. This is the second time he has made this argument. He also suggested massive artillery barrages against civilians in the Chinese city of Xiamen. This kind of discourse at the highest levels of the national security elite underlines why China will not tolerate U.S. control of Taiwan Island. It poses an intolerable strategic security threat. During the Korean War, the U.S. actually did bomb Korean dams, engulfing entire valleys and drowning out entire regions.
So much for free speech. Taiwan has banned popular mainland Chinese rapper Wang Yitai from performing in Taipei for referring to the island as part of China in promotional materials. Wang was scheduled to perform on September 14th and 15th, but has now been denied permission after he posted a series of promotional photos on Chinese social media. These photos show him in front of a sign that says, "Beijing South Station, Beijing to Taipei, China," along with the caption, "Next stop, Taipei, China." Currently, Taipei's own constitution asserts that Taiwan is a part of China.
Chinese video game takes the world by storm. Black Myth Wukong, the newest adventure video game from Hangzhou's Game Science Corporation, has had an unprecedented blockbuster success, selling 14 million copies and generating $765 million in revenue since its release on August 20th, turning it into one of the most successful single-player games in history. However, Western media have criticized the game, claiming that it lacks diversity and inclusivity. Wukong is based on a millennia-old Chinese Buddhist fable, Journey to the West, and involves an enchanted monkey that encounters various characters, including a magic talking pig, spiders, turtles, dragons, and other fantastical creatures. It also has a pantheon of powerful female characters, as well as ungendered characters.
Hungry tourists trekking the Great Wall of China can now get their lunch delivered from the air. Chinese food delivery giant Meituan says its new drone service will bring food, drinks, and other goods like heat relief and medical supplies to customers at the ancient monument. The delivery fee is just 4 yuan, which is 56 cents, and will take orders from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., after which the drones will be used to pick up trash and take them to recycling bins.
China is mass producing household helper robots. China's Unitree Corporation is mass producing a household helper robot called the G1. This robot is already available commercially for $16,000. According to China watcher Arnaud Bertrand, household helper robots will do for China what the Ford Model T did for the US, symbolize China's rise to world preeminent power status, much like the Model T did for the US. According to economist Hajun Chang, the washing machine was a greater revolution than the internet because of the way it freed up labor. The household helper robot may have the same potential.
And now to our main segment. Last week, the New York Times reported that Biden approved a classified secret nuclear strategy in March, which orders U.S. forces to prepare for possible coordinated nuclear confrontations with China, Russia, and North Korea. This reorients the U.S. deterrent strategy to focus on China's supposed rapid nuclear arsenal expansion. This document, called the Nuclear Employment Guidance, is updated every 4 years and is so classified that no electronic copies exist, only a handful of hard copies given to Pentagon and national security officials. According to White House officials, this new strategy aims to deter China to deter Russia, the PRC, and North Korea simultaneously. And they point to emerging cooperation between China and Russia, as well as arms that North Korea and Iran have been providing to Russia. To help us make sense of this turn in nuclear strategy and what it signals in the new Cold War, we are joined today by Peter Kuznick. Peter is a professor of history at American University and founder and director of its Nuclear Studies Institute. He, along with Oliver Stone, was co-author of the Showtime documentary film series and book both titled The Untold History of the United States. Peter, welcome to the China Report.
Glad to be with you.
Lots to get into, but first maybe we can talk about this leaked nuclear strategy. Peter, I'm interested in hearing what should we make of this recent leak, and based on past history, what can we assume about U.S. projections and U.S. nuclear strategy towards China as it escalates toward war?
In some ways, this is not a surprise. It's entirely predictable. We look at the direction U.S. strategy has been taking in the past 6 years. It was back in 2018 that Mattis said that the main threats to U.S. security were no longer global terrorism, but Russia and China. And they've very quickly identified China as what they call the pacing threat. And we've seen the kinds of comments as the conflict over Taiwan has intensified, especially since Nancy Pelosi's visit. But even before that, during the Trump administration, and Biden doubled down on the hostile policy toward China. And then you put that together with the fact that they've been looking for excuses to rearm again, to intensify and accelerate the pace of U.S. military armament. This is a theme we've seen over and over through the Cold War and since the Cold War. It's what the Project for New American Century is all about: American weakness and the need to build up America's military quote unquote defenses. And so, but they need an excuse to do that. And Russia has shown itself almost incapable of winning in Ukraine. So Russia does not pose a particularly credible threat. However, China, as the economic superpower and one that is modernizing and expanding its abilities, seems to pose a much more credible threat. And so when the Pentagon starts talking about China's strategy of increasing its nuclear arsenal. China, as we know, believed in limited deterrence, thought that even having 200 nuclear weapons would be a sufficient deterrent. But in recent years, China has become increasingly doubted the viability of its second strike capability. And so, and we see this from way back. I'm reminded of a 2006 report by Lieber and Press that didn't get a lot of attention in the United States. But it said that the United States now in 2006 has a first strike capability against both Russia and China. That if the United States launched a nuclear attack, neither country would have the capability of responding. We know that that sent head spinning in the Kremlin. I don't know the Chinese response as well, but I do have watched China's strengthening military capabilities. Uh, just this week, reports coming out about new weapon systems that China is deploying. And we know that, so China started to doubt the viability of its second strike ability, and it went from 200 nuclear weapons. Now the reports are over 500 nuclear weapons, with the goal of 1,000 or more by 2030. And the Pentagon says 1,500 by 2035. What does that mean? Right now, we've got two people with veto power over the future existence of life on our planet: Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin. This makes it sound like Xi Jinping wants to join that club. Have three people now with arsenals strong enough to provoke nuclear winter. And but the U.S. has seized on this as a pretext for what it wanted to do anyway. We saw the report that came out last year, the Bipartisan Congressional Strategic Posture Commission report, calling for a dramatic increase in U.S. weaponry and military spending. On top of that, there's another recent congressional report calling for the same thing. So they're latching on to China's enhanced capabilities in order to justify the increase in military spending that they wanted all along. The United States still vastly outspends China. As KJ points out, the United States might not have as many vehicles, naval vehicles, as China does, but in terms of throw weight and in terms of capabilities, the United States still is the hegemonic naval power. But
Yeah,
as the United
Peter.
States, yeah,
Yeah, I just want to emphasize, the United States not only outspends the next 10 countries, it actually outspends 189 countries put together. It is simply the largest military budget on the planet. But I want to, break down a little bit, these notions of a Chinese threat or a credible Chinese threat. I think it's very, very important for us to look at the history. In 1984, the DIA projected that China had about 200 nuclear warheads, and then it said it would have about 800 in 1 decade. Well, 1 decade passed, and in 1999, they said China had 200 warheads. So they didn't increase them. And then, but they said that China would have 460 by 2020. Well, 2018, 2020 rolled around and they did the estimate again. And again, China's estimate of nuclear weapons was 200. And now they're claiming that it's going to be 1,500 in 1.5 decades. So there is a long, long history of threat inflation, just as the US had this incredible history of threat inflation against the USSR. It, overestimated by 20 to 50 fold what was the actual Soviet nuclear arsenal. Given that China has a minimal deterrent, it has no launch on warning, that it separates warheads from delivery vehicles, and it has no first strike capacity. I think that it's important for us to understand that what we're really seeing here is a U.S. pretext to escalate, which it has been doing, consistently since the early 2000s, and most certainly since the nuclear strategy of Barack Obama. But essentially, it's using China as a pretext, as you point out, to increase its nuclear capabilities. And this is my point. I see this as first a way of normalizing nuclear strikes on Korea. And the reason for that is because the US is clearly escalating to war against China. And it is also becoming very clear to the United States that even with the best technology and with the dispersed, distributed attacks of the third offset, it cannot prevail in nuclear war, which is why it is trying to normalize the idea of nuclear strikes on China. The organization that I always watch is the Center for a New American Security, which has obsessively mapped out war with China. And in March, they put forth a position paper saying that first, the US needed to fully integrate nuclear activities into US planning and exercises, that it needed to develop operational concepts. Operational concepts is Pentagon jargon for war plans. So develop war plans for visible theater nuclear generation. In other words, the deliberate use of tactical nuclear weapons, and then consider expanded theater nuclear weapons capacities. I see this as part of a propaganda offensive, both to normalize and to justify US nuclear escalation against China, as well as to make the general public accept the possibility of nuclear strikes, tactical nuclear strikes, as delineated by US nuclear strategy, which is essentially first strike or counterforce strikes.
It's interesting, and I place it the way this nuclear employment guidance that Sanger was reporting on, the fact that it talks about being able to win a nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea is terribly significant, because it's really more in terms of Russia that nuclear war has been on the agenda recently. Uh, there was just an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. I don't know if you saw it, about the debate among nuclear strategists. Most for years, we've assumed that their strategy was a deterrence strategy. That the idea that both sides could destroy each other in mutually assured destruction, and that would somehow prevent people from assuming that nuclear war was a viable option. But there is a sizable faction in the nuclear community who thinks that our technological breakthroughs now give us the capability of waging and winning a nuclear war. And that's not an insignificant faction. And they are weighing in on this, and they are insane. But for years, we always assumed that the intercontinental ballistic missiles were vulnerable to a surprise attack, and possibly the bombers. But we always assumed that the submarines would be an effective deterrent, even if the other parts of the triad were wiped out. But now there are people who are arguing that the latest round of technological breakthroughs allows us to actually target those submarines also in a way that we could launch a nuclear war and win it. And so, whereas most people think that since the end of the Cold War, that the possibility of launching a nuclear war by anything other than mistake or inadvertence is out of the realm of possibility, there are actually people who are planning this scenario for a preemptive strike that would allow the United States to defeat Russia and China and North Korea all. So, plus, as you always point out correctly, we are moving closer and closer toward war in the Pacific. And U.S. policy, we have General Minihan saying he thinks the U.S. and China would be at war by 2025. You have other strategists saying the U.S. window of winning a war against China closes by 2027. So the dynamic is against the United States at this point. And uh, I'm not sure what those supposed silo fields signify, but I can understand from a Chinese perspective why they might at this point be considering expanding their nuclear arsenal. But I agree, historically, that has never been their policy. And I absolutely agree and have written about this question of threat inflation, which I know how the United States has done over and over and over again against the Soviet Union. And we even look at Reagan. Reagan's claiming that the United States was so much weaker than the Soviet Union as an excuse for the buildup. But we saw this under Carter. It's not only under the Republican hawks, this has been a bipartisan policy. And if you look what was coming out of that Democratic Party convention just a few days ago, the kind of flag waving, USA, USA chanting, hyper patriotic militarism and the celebration of American lethality, I there were a lot of things some things I really liked about what the Democrats were saying. But when it came to foreign policy and military policy, I thought it was frightening. So I'm very, very worried that we're closer to nuclear war now over Russia and China, and who knows what's going to come out of the Middle East, but that we're closer now than we've ever been.
Peter, in 1980, Jimmy Carter signed Presidential Directive 59, which is essentially the counterforce doctrine, NUTS, that is, nuclear utilization target selection. This is essentially the first strike doctrine. It's not countervalue like MAD, it's first strike, counter strike. And this is essentially, to put it in its simplest terms, the idea of this is that the US is going to win by throwing a nuclear sucker punch on the rest of the planet. I think this is extraordinarily, extraordinarily dangerous, but it also ties into, once again, I don't think it's possible to over exaggerate the nuclear inflation that the US has done against China and against the USSR. For example, in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was concerned that China was building 1,500 nuclear silos in south in southern Fujian province. They actually sent in agents in on the ground, and it turned out that these were actually Chinese roundhouses, tulo, that are made from rammed earth, and these have been around for 600, 700 years. And so, but these were mistaken because they were circular projections that from satellite pictures looked like silos. Same thing regarding the nuclear construction or the silos in currently the Northwest. It's unclear. It hasn't been verified that any of this is actually silos, or even if they were silos, if they would actually be used. They could simply be decoys. And so I think that we have to take all of this into consideration, that there is a long history of threat inflation combined with the fact that the US doctrine clearly is first strike. It's the nuclear sucker punch. And I think that's the piece that I think we need to focus on rather than, the kind of speculative assumptions about China, which historically have shown not to be true. As I pointed out, historically, Chinese nuclear capacity has flatlined since the 1980s. They haven't brought new nuclear capacity online. They don't even have a complete triad at this point. And even if they did, they have noisy submarines. It's unclear whether they could even get out of the South China Sea. So I think this is an important context for us to bring to this discussion.
I'll also put it in another context, and that's that all 9 nuclear powers are modernizing, making their nuclear arsenals more efficient, and more lethal. The United States is introducing new nuclear weapons. The cruise missile, sea-launched cruise missile, um, is a very, very dangerous capability. But what we also are seeing is that at the end of the Cold War, there were about 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. That number has now shrunk to around 12,000, but several countries are already committed and have begun the process of expanding their nuclear arsenals again. The British are talking about increasing their Trident capability by 40%. So what I'm afraid we're seeing now is we're going the opposite direction globally. So on the one hand, and then there's this report, very troubling report out of the Financial Times last week. Again, not a credible source, but in some ways a worrisome source, that Russia's threshold for use of nuclear weapons is actually considerably lower than the United States or the West or NATO previously thought. And so we're getting those kind of reports, plus this reports coming out of Gordon Chang and Michael Rubin talking about Taiwan having to learn from Ukraine and adopt an offensive military strategy and hit those Chinese dams and kill tens of millions of people. I mean, there's so much coming out that's so troubling, even insane at this point, because anybody who contemplates nuclear war is certifiably insane. Because as we've known since the 1980s, the likelihood of this triggering a full-scale nuclear winter is actually quite great. And the latest studies coming out of Robach and Toon and the others is that the threshold for nuclear winter is actually significantly lower than what Sagan and his colleagues had written about in the 1980s. So anything that could possibly trigger a nuclear exchange, with the assumption that it's going to start off with tactical weapons and be very limited, we know from years and years of wargaming this stuff that they almost never, the idea of a limited nuclear war is almost unthinkable because there's never a point at which they stop. And it always goes to Armageddon. So just the fact that this is now being discussed so openly as a realistic possibility, I find terrifying.
Peter,
Peter,
you
it's not just
mentioned.
that.
Oh, sorry. Peter, you mentioned war games, but I want to point out right now that like the U.S. and South Korea are in South Korea right now doing joint military exercises. They're called Ulchi Freedom Shield military exercises. And these annual joint military drills the U.S. conducts with South Korea, and they simulate war games against North Korea. And they simulate the invasion of North Korea. They include live fire practices, attacks from the land, air, sea, space as well. The war games present sort of a dress rehearsal for regime change in North Korea, and they include these kinds of nuclear war game simulations. And on top of that, just a few weeks ago, NATO held its annual summit in Washington, D.C. And one of the key takeaways from this summit is that basically NATO is pivoting to the Pacific in order to confront China. So that means NATO will expand its partnerships into the Indo-Pacific, and they'll try and move toward an Asian NATO to counter North Korea and China. So I was wondering if you could talk about how this new leaked nuclear strategy kind of connects to all of these different other geopolitical factors at play, and how dangerous this entire situation is given all its context.
Yeah, that NATO summit, clearly they've been thinking about expanding to the Pacific for quite some time. They wanted to open up an office in Tokyo, and Macron actually vetoed that, which, consider his hawkishness when it comes to Ukraine, was a little bit surprising. Um, but I think to connect the two is very important. Uh, the because and I also look at the recent decision to pass over Victoria Nuland as the number two in the State Department. Wendy Sherman stepped down. Victoria Nuland took over as the acting number two in the State Department. And many people assumed she was just going to get the permanent position. But the fact that they passed over her, and she's the leading anti-Russia hawk, and they chose instead Kurt Campbell, the leading anti-China hawk, shows what their priorities are. And so the so-called Asia pivot that we've been talking about for 12, 13 years now, uh, and which hasn't fully happened, is something that is very much on the agenda that they are planning to do. There was a RAND report called Avoiding a Prolonged War over Ukraine because Ukraine was no longer the priority, that China is the real priority, the pacing threat, as they like to call it. So I think that the two do go together, and uh, that clearly China is considered the main focus of U.S. attention and U.S. war planning and U.S. shift in priorities, and that's what this Sanger report seems to confirm once again. And you talk about the war games that the U.S. is carrying out now in Korea. I mean, we've seen one after another on both fronts because there's this kind of a broad militarization and a war mentality that's taken hold in Washington. Um, so I don't see so much as an either or. They believe they can do both, plus the Middle East. So now they're talking about China, Russia, and North Korea together because they see it holistically as the combined threat to the United States, quote unquote threat. Because as we know, U.S. hegemony is weakening, that the United States does not have the same kind of control or influence that it did. The other thing going on during the NATO summit was that Modi was in Moscow, and that was incredibly significant. They've tried to counterbalance that now with his visit to Kyiv and his talk with Biden, but the significance should not be underestimated there. The global South is not going along with the United States. Biden kept on saying this is a struggle, a battle between autocracy and democracy. Well, the London Economist, of all places, said to most of the world, it looks like a struggle between autocracy and hypocrisy. And so much of the world is just not going along with the U.S. in its hegemonic efforts at this point. And so we don't have a lot of allies. And as even Fareed Zakaria pointed out the other day, that whereas Europe was once such a dominant part of the world economy, now it accounts for less than 15% of global GDP, with Asia accounting uh, 54 to 57% of global GDP. So the balance has shifted, and the U.S. is trying to keep pace in order to maintain its hegemony. And that is putting the world in a very dangerous position right now.
I've said that, the US desire for hegemony is so extreme that it would rather see the end of the world than the end of their privilege and power. And I think that what Amanda referred to regarding Korea is probably the most uh, clear example. It's not simply that they're discussing or have strategy or policy around nuclearization. On the Korean Peninsula right now, they are rehearsing nuclear strikes on North Korea, which is always a pretext for war with China because there's a mutual defense treaty. Last year, the United States rehearsed 20 strategic nuclear exercises on the Korean Peninsula. They brought in an Ohio class submarine, and just very recently, the South Korean Deputy National Security Chief has threatened a preemptive nuclear strike on North Korea, something that he has absolutely no authority to do because South Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons, and secondly, he doesn't get to make those decisions. So the fact that all of this is being put out in the open and that there are active, deliberate signals of nuclear rehearsals and nuclear strikes happening in that part of the world leads me to think that this is completely normalized within the ruling class. And if you will, Kurt Campbell has said that he would unleash a magnificent symphony of death in Asia, a magnificent symphony of death. I believe that he's referring to the nuclear option. So I think this is very important to note. At the same time, that once again, if we note China's response, in 1961, the US had a plan to wipe out 60 to 90 of China's cities, destroy the entire industrial base of China. And China's response at that time was not to engage in a nuclear arms race, but simply to replicate its entire industrial base along the hidden inland corridors, which is why you have huge cities like Chongqing inside the mountains. Essentially, they were prepared or they were preparing just to survive rather than to retaliate. And I think that is a very, very important message that I think China says that nuclear war can never be fought, can never be won, and should never be fought. And they have been asking the United States not to shirk its responsibilities for denuclearization and not to seek nuclear dominance, nuclear strategic dominance, which I think is part of the reason why there's some of this discussion happening right now in Beijing between Wang Yi and Jake Sullivan.
Well, KJ, let me ask you a question. If you were in Beijing and you saw what's going on in Korea, and you saw the debates going on among American policymakers, and agreed with your analysis of what's happening, wouldn't you consider expanding your nuclear arsenal? I mean,
I
it
think there are
doesn't
many
strike
ways.
me as totally irrational for them to consider doing so.
Well, I think the first point to make there is that if that is the case, and it's unclear if that is the case, then certainly it is a reaction to US threats and not the other way around, which the US is always inverting causality. But the second point I would make is that there are many things that can be done in short of a nuclear escalation or moving further up the escalation ladder, including the kind of engagement, discussion, as well as creating more decoys, which may be what they are doing. So anything is possible at this point, but we can look at the historical record, which goes back decades, and we see that China has not escalated and it has not engaged in a nuclear arms race. What it has done is it has kept the absolute nuclear minimum, almost a symbolic deterrent. It detaches its warheads from its delivery vehicles. It has declared a declarative policy of no first strike, and it keeps its weapons with no launch on warning. I think these are really, really good policies, and I think it would be better if the rest of the world came down to China's policies rather than accusing and trying to press gang China into an unwanted nuclear escalation.
Well, KJ, I totally agree with that. Without, you know, in a sane world, that's where we'll go. And then we go further and get rid of those last couple hundred nuclear weapons also. Unfortunately, we're not in a sane world. We're in a world in which the lunatics have taken over the asylum and they're making policy. And maybe they don't think it's going to lead to full-scale nuclear war, because even if it's a partial, you know, the reports about even 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons exchanged between India and Pakistan would cause partial nuclear winter and produce up to 2 billion deaths around the planet. Well, we don't have 100, we've got 12,000. And they're not Hiroshima's size. Most of them are between 7 and 70 times as powerful as the bomb that was used on Hiroshima. So
Mhm. And
I
about
mean,
5,000 of them are US, and about 5,700 belong to the US, and about 5,000 belong to Russia.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
So,
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
no,
I
I just,
mean,
I'm worried.
I think we're all extraordinarily worried. I mean, I agree with you absolutely. We are in this insane upside down world where nuclear first strike is part of US military doctrine. And it's almost like, a school shooter who wants to shoot up the entire school, except for them, the entire world is a school. So then the question falls on us, what do we do? I think the most important thing is not to buy into the delusions of the school shooter about the paranoid other, but rather to do our best as citizens in the imperial core to see what we can do to restrain our own leaders. I think that is probably the best action that we can take in order to de escalate things.
I agree, and that's what we're trying to do.
I agree as well. I really like the point that you guys made earlier in the segment about how this leaked nuclear strategy is part of this propaganda campaign to normalize nuclear war. And it's been growing pretty steadily. Trump, just a few weeks ago, he was scaremongering around the number of U.S. weapon or nuclear weapons that China had in an interview with Elon Musk. And after the leaked nuclear strategy was published, the story about that was published in the New York Times, just like clockwork, The Economist published an article that was titled, If a China and American war went nuclear, who would win? It's showing on the screen right now. After 45 days of conventional fighting, nukes would be tempting, warmongers suggest. And it's a ridiculous question to pose because, if a nuclear war were to break out between China and America, no one would win. We'd all be killed. But the fact that they're even posing that question and publishing it in The Economist, a mainstream publication, just really shows where we're at in terms of, how psychotic the U.S. war drive against China has become and how normalized even the idea of nuclear war has become.
You
But
know,
yeah.
as Reagan and Gorbachev said, and has been repeated ever since, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. But there are people there, and there have been all along, from the even right after World War II. Leslie Groves in January of 1946 called for a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union back then. And then we had Curtis LeMay. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he welcomed the nuclear war. He said, "This is the strongest we're ever going to be, and we should get it out of the way." And we've had nuclear planners ever since, who said, well, even if we lost 40, 60, 80 million people, it's worth it to get rid of our enemies. And we've got people now who are making that same gamble. Uh, do I think that Biden would tolerate that and accept it? No. But that kind of argument and reasoning makes nuclear war that much more possible. That plus what Kennedy and Khrushchev learned during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that when a crisis like that develops, you have no control. They both knew that they had lost control and that we survived the Cuban Missile Crisis by pure, blind, dumb luck, not by brilliant statesmanship. But contemporary leaders, many of them have lost sight of that. Or Kennedy's insight in his great American University commencement address. So you have to put a nuclear armed adversary in the position where they either have to use their nuclear weapons or suffer a humiliating defeat is either a colossal failure of statesmanship or a collective death wish on the part of the human species. And we still are doing that, despite knowing the insanity of it and the consequences.
Dangerous times ahead. Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining us today on the China Report. It was a pleasure to have you.
It was my pleasure. I can't wait to watch it again so I can write down all those things that KJ said about these various red inflations.
And now to our Red Scare of the week. Well, the McCarthyite witch hunt against Democratic vice presidential pick Tim Walz is the gift that keeps on giving. Republicans are really ramping up the attack, despite, as we covered last week, his record of supporting anti-China legislation while in Congress. In this Fox News clip from last week, author Peter Schweitzer explains why China is, quote unquote, grooming Tim Walz. Just for full transparency, Schweitzer also ridiculously alleged that this platform, Breakthrough News, is part of what he called a Chinese influence network that was based on false allegations about our funding and content, which is not the case. But here's the clip and why China is supposedly grooming Tim Walz.
Do you believe that the Communist Party has been grooming Tim Walz?
Oh, I think there's no question about it, Maria. It goes back to the exchange program that he ran and brought hundreds of students from the United States to China. In the early press accounts, Tim Walz describes it as unique and unusual and different, a program that nobody else has. And at the same time that he's bringing those students there, by the students' accounting, Tim Walz is saying things like, well, in China, nobody is poor because everybody shares in China, as if sort of the compulsive arm of the CCP is voluntary. I mean, sharing is voluntary. It's a ridiculous statement to make. There are other comments he made. He told students going to China to downplay their Americanness. There's an account from one student, I haven't been able to independently verify it, saying that he brought back lots of copies of Mao's Little Red Book when he was in China. So this is a relationship that's long-standing, and it carried forward when he joined Congress and the actions that he was taking in Congress as well.